The rifle was supposed to be the future. It was 1957, and the United States Army had just officially adopted a new standard-issue battle rifle. The engineers called it the M14. The generals called it a leap forward. The soldiers who would carry it into the jungles of Southeast Asia would call it something far less flattering. The M14 should have been the definitive American rifle, a modernized masterpiece designed to surpass the legendary M1 Garand. Instead, it became one of the shortest-serving standard infantry rifles in American military history. From the frozen plains of Cold War Europe to the brutal, sweltering jungles of Vietnam, the story of the M14 is a story of extraordinary ambition, institutional stubbornness, and the catastrophic gap between what a weapon is designed to do and what war actually demands. This is the story of why that rifle failed. Before we go any further, and if you're new here, welcome. This channel is dedicated to telling the real stories of military history, the ones that shaped the world we live in. Subscribe and hit that bell so you never miss one. To understand why the M14 failed, you first have to understand the impossible standard it was designed to surpass. On January 26, 1945, Lieutenant General George S. Patton sat down and wrote a letter to Major General Levin H. Campbell, Jr., the War Department's Chief of Ordnance. In that letter, Patton wrote 8 words that would echo through military history for decades. He called the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised. That wasn't casual praise from a man known for exaggeration. Patton chose his words deliberately, and he had reason to believe every single one of them. The M1 Garand had entered U.S. Army service in 1936, the brainchild of a Canadian-born engineer named John Cantius Garand, who worked at Springfield Armory and offered his remarkable invention to the government royalty-free. It was the first semi-automatic rifle ever issued en masse to the military of any nation in history. While German soldiers worked their bolt-action Mausers, American infantrymen at Normandy, at Okinawa, and across the Pacific were putting 8 rounds downrange in the time their enemies fired 2. A wartime training film said it plainly. One man with a Garand could do nearly as much damage as 3 men with the old bolt-action Springfield. By the time World War II ended, Springfield Armory and Winchester had produced more than 4 million M1 rifles between them. The weapon served from the beaches of North Africa to the frozen ridges of Korea. It survived mud, salt water, tropical heat, and sub-zero cold. Soldiers beat it against rocks and dragged it through rice paddies, and it kept firing. It was heavy, it was long, and its 8-round en-bloc clip system was peculiar. But it worked. Every single time. That was the standard the M14 was asked to meet, and then exceed. The pressure was not just emotional. By the late 1940s, the United States Army had a genuine institutional problem. Its infantry was carrying 4 entirely different weapons platforms: the M1 Garand, the M1 carbine, the M3 grease gun submachine gun, and the Browning automatic rifle. Each one required different ammunition, different spare parts, different training. In the event of a major war against the Soviet Union in Europe, the war American planners were preparing for, this logistical complexity would be a nightmare. The solution seemed elegant on a drawing board: one rifle to replace them all. The T-44 rifle, which would eventually become the M14, promised everything. It would fire the new 7.62 Husspikes Westlake meter NATO cartridge, a round standardized across the entire North Atlantic Treaty Organization in December of 1953. It would feed from a 20-round detachable box magazine rather than the Garand's 8-round clip. And critically, it would offer selective fire capability. A single switch would allow a soldier to fire semi-automatically for precision, or flip to full automatic for volume of fire. One rifle, one ammunition type, one platform to end the logistical chaos of 4 separate weapon systems. On paper, it sounded like genius. The M14 was officially designated in June 1957. Springfield Armory began tooling the new production line in 1958, and the first service rifles reached U.S. Army hands in 1959. Production contracts went to Winchester and Harrington and Richardson alongside Springfield. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, watching costs and timelines, expected results. What followed was not genius. It was a slow-motion disaster. The first warning signs appeared almost immediately, and they centered on the rifle's most celebrated feature, its selective fire capability. The promise of the M14 was that any ordinary infantryman could flip a switch and transform his precision rifle into a squad-level automatic weapon. In theory, this would replace the Browning automatic rifle and give every fire team organic suppressive fire. In practice, the moment soldiers actually tried it, the dream fell apart. The physics were unforgiving. The 7.62 SI-51 mismatch NATO cartridge was a full-power round. It generated approximately 2,560 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. Tremendous force, the kind of energy designed to reach out and neutralize threats at 500 to 800 yards. The M1 Garand had fired the similar 30 Swelled Springfield cartridge, and the Garand weighed about 9.5 pounds. The M14 was marginally lighter, which sounds like progress until you understand what it meant in automatic fire. When a soldier flipped that selector switch and held the trigger, the M14 did not become a precision weapon. It became something closer to a jackhammer pointed skyward. Soldiers who experienced it firsthand described it graphically. The barrel climbed. The barrel kept climbing. Army historians would record that some soldiers claimed the M14 essentially became an anti-aircraft gun after just a few rounds of automatic fire, the muzzle walking toward the clouds with each successive shot, while bullets scattered uselessly into the air. The Browning automatic rifle, which the M14 was supposed to replace, weighed nearly 16 pounds. Its mass and design were calibrated specifically to absorb that kind of punishment. The M14, lighter and built on the M1 Garand's traditional straight-stock configuration, had none of that ballistic management. Contemporary automatic weapons, the Soviet AK-47, the Belgian FN-FAL, employed pistol grips that gave the shooter mechanical leverage to fight muzzle rise. The M14's conventional rifle stock provided no such advantage. The Army's solution to this engineering failure was both practical and quietly devastating as an admission. They stopped issuing the selector switch. Estimates suggest approximately 90% of the M14s eventually deployed to troops had their fire selectors locked, welded, or simply removed, fixed permanently in semi-automatic mode. The most heavily marketed feature of the rifle, the capability that was supposed to make it superior to the M1 Garand, was officially acknowledged to be more dangerous to the shooter than useful against the enemy. The Army had spent years developing a selective fire battle rifle. Then they removed the selective fire capability and called it progress. The production process added further humiliation. Shortly after manufacturing contracts were awarded, several M14s burst apart during firing range tests due to receiver and bolt failures. Production was halted. Investigations were launched. Secretary of Defense McNamara reportedly described the entire procurement process as, in his words, a disgrace. The first 19 rifles came out of the factory in September 1959. By mid-1960, fewer than 10,000 had been delivered. By mid-1961, production had reached just over $133,000, crawling toward a requirement that was numbered in the millions. Meanwhile, a September 1962 report by the Comptroller of the U.S. Department of Defense reached a conclusion so damning it seems almost impossible. The M14 was deemed completely inferior even to the World War II-era M1 Garand it had replaced. The rifle designed to be the future was already being called worse than the past. In January 1963, a battle took place in the Mekong Delta that would serve as a brutal preview of what the M14 was about to face. Near the village of Ap Bac in Dinh Thuong Province, South Vietnam, a South Vietnamese army force equipped with M14 rifles and supported by American advisors attempted to destroy a Viet Cong battalion. On paper, the math favored the attackers enormously: 1,200 South Vietnamese troops against roughly 350 Viet Cong fighters. The Allied forces had artillery, helicopters, and armored personnel carriers. The Viet Cong had discipline, prepared positions, and AK-47 assault rifles. By the end of January 2nd, the Viet Cong had shot down 5 American helicopters, killed 3 American advisors, inflicted dozens of casualties on South Vietnamese forces, and escaped under the cover of darkness. American reporters who arrived the next morning asked Brigadier General Robert York what had happened. York reportedly replied, "What the hell's it look like happened, boy? They got away, that's what happened." Lieutenant Colonel John Paul Van, the senior American advisor to the 7th South Vietnamese Division, and one of the most consequential figures in the early Vietnam War, called it a miserable damn performance. What the Battle of Ap Bac demonstrated was a fundamental tactical mismatch. The Viet Cong with their AK-47s firing 7.62 wax 39mm intermediate cartridges from a weapon specifically designed for rapid close-range combat in dense terrain had a decisive advantage in the kind of fighting Vietnam demanded. The M14, a long and heavy rifle built for the open plains of Central Europe, was clumsy in jungle ambush conditions. At 44 inches in length and roughly 9 to 10 pounds unloaded, it was extraordinarily difficult to swing quickly through dense vegetation, to carry on all-day jungle patrols, or to bring to bear in the split-second violence of a close-quarters ambush. And the ammunition problem compounded everything. A soldier carrying M14 ammunition in the 7.62 mm NATO caliber could bring approximately 120 rounds on a standard combat load, roughly 6 20-round magazines. A soldier with an AK-47 could carry far more rounds for equivalent weight. In a firefight where rate of fire and ammunition volume determined who survived the first 30 seconds, the calculus was stark. American soldiers were being outgunned not necessarily in raw firepower, but in practical, sustainable combat volume. But perhaps no failure of the M14 was more visually striking or more thoroughly documented than what the jungles of Southeast Asia did to its stock. The M1 Garand had carried a walnut stock through 2.5 decades of service. It had served in the freezing mud of the Hurtgen forest, on the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima, and in the bone-chilling winters of Korea. The wood, combined with the rifle's gas-operated system, proved durable through conditions that would have destroyed lesser designs. The M14 began service with stocks of walnut or birch, beautiful wood, the kind that gleamed on a parade ground and photographed magnificently for Army press releases. And in the climate-controlled environment of an American military base, those stocks were perfectly adequate. Vietnam was not a climate-controlled environment. Southeast Asia subjected the M14's wooden stocks to a sustained assault that no test cycle had adequately simulated. The humidity in the Vietnamese highlands and Mekong Delta averaged between 80 and 90% during monsoon season. Temperatures regularly exceeded 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Soldiers operated for weeks in conditions where their rifles were constantly soaked, dried out, soaked again, and dragged through muddy rice paddies. Under these conditions, the walnut and birch stocks of the M14 absorbed moisture and swelled. They expanded, they warped. And when a rifle stock warps, the precise relationship between the stock, barrel, and action changes. The pressure points shift. The bedding, or the way the action sits in the stock, is no longer consistent. On a rifle requiring that the parts be assembled with careful precision to maintain accuracy, warped wood was catastrophic. Soldiers reported watching their rifles lose zero, their shots drifting unpredictably as the stock moved beneath them. The rifle that had tested beautifully at Fort Benning, Georgia, was becoming useless in Quang Nam province. The Army did eventually develop fiberglass stocks to solve this problem. But the timing was a bitter irony. The fiberglass stocks were produced and ready, but the M14 was discontinued before they could be distributed widely to troops in the field. The soldiers who needed them most never got them. Compare this to the M1 Garand. Veterans of the Pacific had dragged their Garands through the tidal swamps of New Georgia and the monsoon jungles of the Philippines. The Garand's design had a different relationship between action and stock, and its battle-proven history in the most hostile environments on Earth was already documented and respected. The weapon General Patton had called the greatest battle implement ever devised had passed its tests in conditions every bit as brutal as Vietnam. The M14 was failing under similar conditions within months of widespread deployment. By 1965, when the United States committed major ground forces to Vietnam with the arrival of combat troops in earnest, the tactical crisis was becoming impossible to ignore. American infantry companies moving through triple-canopy jungle faced a specific and terrifying tactical problem. The jungle itself was an enemy, dense, disorienting, and brutally limiting to weapons designed for open-field European warfare. A 44-inch rifle is not merely uncomfortable in thick vegetation, it becomes a physical impediment. Soldiers trying to move quickly through dense brush found themselves catching their long barrels on every vine, every branch. Clearing a trail through the undergrowth while simultaneously maintaining combat readiness with an unwieldy 4-foot rifle was exhausting and dangerous. The ambush was the primary form of combat in Vietnam. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army forces had refined it into an art form. The typical jungle ambush lasted seconds to minutes, not hours. It was initiated at close range, sometimes as close as 20 or 30 feet. with devastating concentrated firepower from prepared positions. In those seconds, a soldier's ability to bring his weapon to bear quickly, to fire on a target that might be just meters away in the shadows, was everything. The M14's size worked against it in every dimension of that scenario. Its weight exhausted soldiers on approach. Its length made it slow to maneuver. Its semi-automatic mode, remember 90% of these rifles had been locked out of automatic fire, meant that maintaining volume of fire required deliberate trigger control at a moment when deliberation could get you killed. The AK-47 in enemy hands was, in this specific context, simply better suited to the fight. It was shorter, it was lighter. It fired on automatic reliably. It functioned in the mud and heat of Vietnam with a mechanical simplicity that made it extraordinarily forgiving of poor maintenance. A critical advantage in a conflict where soldiers might go days or weeks without access to proper cleaning equipment. The AK-47 had been designed by Mikhail Kalashnikov specifically with the principle that combat weapons must function when abused. It did. The M14 had been designed for a war against Soviet tank columns on the flat plains of Central Europe. It was a weapon optimized for standoff engagements at 400 to 800 yards, where its accuracy and the power of the 7.62 NATO round would be decisive. Vietnam almost never gave American soldiers those engagements. The enemy fought at close range, in the jungle, on their terms. The strategic assumptions embedded in the M14's very design were wrong for the war being fought. American soldiers recognized this with painful clarity. Survey data from troops in Vietnam showed that 67% of surveyed Marines preferred lighter, more effective weapons to the M14. The men carrying the rifle every day, the ones whose lives depended on it, understood what the weapons testers at Fort Benning had missed. The future of infantry combat in Vietnam was not the long-range precision duel. It was the savage, close-range, high-volume firefight in the dark. The end, when it came, arrived with unusual speed. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara ordered a halt to M14 production on January 23, 1963. The order came before the United States had even committed major combat forces to Vietnam, a recognition at the highest levels of the Defense Department that the rifle was already obsolete. More than 1 million M14s had been manufactured by that point. The production order was capped there. In 1964, McNamara directed that the M16 would replace the M14 as the Army's standard rifle. The M14 was officially replaced in 1967. In practical terms on the ground in Vietnam, the transition happened even faster. By 1967, the Army was rapidly distributing M16s to infantry units, and by 1970, only a handful of M14s remained in active use in Vietnam. Do the arithmetic, and the verdict is stark. The M14 was adopted as standard issue in 1957. It was officially replaced as the primary infantry rifle in 1967. 10 years, among the most generous estimates. Many historians point out that in practical terms, from the time it was first widely issued to troops to the time it was largely phased out in combat, the window was closer to 6 or 7 years. By any measure, the M14 holds the distinction of serving one of the shortest periods as the standard-issue infantry rifle in American military history. The Garand it replaced had served from 1936 to 1957, 21 years, through a global war and a major regional conflict. The M14 lasted 1 decade at the outside. The ripple effects of this failure reached far beyond one rifle program. The rapid, embarrassing transition from the M14 to the M16 was a watershed moment in American small arms doctrine. It validated, in the most consequential possible way, the argument that had been building since the late 1940s that the era of the full-power battle rifle was over, that the future of infantry weapons lay not in the massive cartridges of World War II, but in lighter, smaller caliber ammunition that allowed soldiers to carry more rounds, fire more quickly, and equip themselves for the close-range, high-intensity fights that modern warfare actually produced. The AR-15, which became the M16, was not a perfect rifle. Its early deployments in Vietnam were troubled by jamming problems that would later be traced in significant part to deliberate bureaucratic sabotage by Army officers who had backed the M14 and wanted its successor to fail. But the M16's fundamental concept, an intermediate cartridge, a lighter platform, high capacity, controllable automatic fire, was correct. The M16 and its direct descendant, the M4 carbine, have now served the American military for nearly 60 years. The rifle designed to replace them is still being sought. The M14, meanwhile, found the role it had actually been designed for all along, after it was no longer needed to fill it. There is an irony at the heart of the M14 story that history has recorded with a certain quiet satisfaction. The rifle that failed as a standard infantry weapon, the rifle that was too big for the jungle and too inaccurate in automatic fire, and too finicky in the humidity, turned out to be genuinely excellent at the one thing it was always fundamentally built for: reaching out and hitting a target at distance with the 7.62 NATO cartridge. When stripped of all the impossible requirements layered onto it, replace the carbine, replace the submachine gun, replace the bar, be everything to everyone. And given instead a specific, focused mission, the M14 found its footing. American Army units converted thousands of M14s into M21 sniper rifles, which served as the standard Army sniper weapon until 1988. In the global war on terror, as American forces found themselves fighting again in open terrain, the mountains of Afghanistan, the flat expanses of Iraq, the M14 came back out of storage. Fitted with modern scopes, synthetic stocks, and upgraded chassis systems, the rifle in its Mk14 enhanced battle rifle and M39 enhanced marksman rifle variants provided the long-range precision that the M16 and M4 family simply could not match at distance. Sergeant First Class Randy Shugart, Delta Force operator and Medal of Honor recipient, killed during the Battle of Mogadishu in 1993, carried an M14 variant. From a helicopter, using the rifle's range and power, he engaged targets that an M16 could not have effectively reached. That image of a special operator choosing the old, heavy, problematic M14 in a specific, demanding situation captures something true about the weapon. It was never a bad rifle. It was a rifle assigned an impossible mission by people who refused to recognize that one platform cannot replace four. The M14 was a precision long-range weapon asked to be a submachine gun, an automatic rifle, and a standard-issue arm for jungle warfare simultaneously. Any one of those requirements in isolation might have been manageable. All of them together broke the design. Today, the M14 serves in its truest role: behind ceremony flags at military funerals, in the polished hands of honor guards, and in the forward operating bases of special operations forces who need to reach out past the range of the modern carbine. It is in those moments exactly what John Garand's successors always hoped it could be: a precise, powerful, elegant rifle, the legitimate heir to the greatest battle implement ever devised. Just not, as history proved without mercy, the weapon the Vietnam War needed. The M1 Garand survived Normandy and Okinawa and Korea. It proved itself over 2 decades and across 3 continents against the worst conditions warfare could produce. The M14, its designated successor, served for a single decade, a fragment of that legacy, before the jungle rendered its verdict. The lesson the M14 carries is not simply about wood stocks or automatic fire or cartridge selection. It is about the institutional impulse to build one answer to every question, to demand that a single tool solve contradictory problems, and to ignore the evidence when field soldiers tell you clearly that the answer you built does not work. The greatest failure of the M14 was not mechanical. It was the failure to listen. General Patton's words about the M1 Garand were not merely praise for a rifle. They were a warning to every weapons designer and procurement officer who came after. Understand what soldiers actually need, in the conditions they actually face, in the wars they actually fight. Not the wars you planned for, the wars that find you. The M14 forgot that lesson. Vietnam reminded the United States Army of it, and every infantry rifle that has followed, from the M16 to the M4 to the weapons being tested today, has been built in the long shadow of that reminder. The rifle that was supposed to replace the legend became a cautionary tale. And somewhere in that story, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the 8-round ping of an M1 Garand's empty clip echoing across history. If this story of American military history resonated with you, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. New videos every week covering the real stories behind the weapons, the battles, and the decisions that shaped the world. Leave a comment below. Do you think the M14 deserved a better fate, or was it doomed from the start? I read every single response. See you in the next one.